Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Officer for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this World Affairs Today program. Tonight's panelists will discuss the situation in Mali, the events of the last year, and whether the possibility exists for Mali to become what Somalia was 20 years ago. And if this is even a fair question to ask, or what other fate the future holds for this West African country. Joining us this evening is Ambassador Vicki Huddleston, Ambassador Tim Carney, and serving as moderator, Gerald Hyman of CSIS. Ambassador Huddleston is a retired U.S. ambassador, having served in Mali from 2002 to 2005. Her distinguished State Department career spanned over 16 years, focusing on Africa and Latin America. Ambassador Huddleston's final post before retiring in 2011 was U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Though retired to New Mexico, Ambassador Huddleston has remained engaged with Mali and has written in the New York Times about the situation there. Ambassador Tim Carney is the former U.S. Ambassador to Sudan and Haiti and has served in a number of conflict areas, including Cambodia, South Africa, and Iraq. In 1993, he served as a special political advisor to the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General in Somalia. Ambassador Carney currently serves as Executive Vice President of the Clinton-Bush Haiti Fund. Finally, our moderator this evening, Gerald Hyman, is a Senior Advisor at CSIS and President of its Hills Program on Governance. From 2002 to 2007, he was the Director of the U.S. Agency for International Development's Global Office of Democracy and Governments. Between 1990 and 2002, he held a number of posts at USAID, dealing with democracy and governance, and developing the program strategy paradigm for USAID democracy and governance assistance. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers.
Good evening. So I thought we would essentially take three sets of questions. The first is, how do we understand, analyze what's been happening in Mali over the last year? The second is, what can we learn about Mali from our experience in Somalia, and in particular about policy? Will Somalia, Stephanie said, will Mali become like Somalia was? Somalia is happily getting better. And third, what should U.S. policy be? What, if anything, should the U.S. do in Mali? What should others do? What are the risks? What are the costs? What are the benefits? How should that compare with our experience in Somalia? Hopefully better. What lessons have we learned from Somalia? And also perhaps, since I'm sure it'll come up, from Iraq and Afghanistan, although that's not technically our topic. So I thought I'd start, just to get everybody up to speed here, with a short description of what's been happening over the last year or so, and I think this is a fairly neutral description, fairly factual. There undoubtedly will be someone who will take issue, but I think they're reasonably straightforward. About a year ago, military troops in Mali managed a coup d'etat, overthrew the country's democratically elected president and government, complaining that the government had not been supporting them in their fight against the rebellion, at that time relatively low-boiling, of nomadic Tuaregs in the north. That created a kind of a power vacuum, a kind of an area with no real legitimate government, in which the separatist rebels, along later with forces linked anyway to Al-Qaeda, to take over a good portion of the desert in the north. Not really so different in some ways from Afghanistan and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Effectively, that split the country into two parts, the part that was controlled by the rebels in the north, mostly desert, and the southern part, which was tentatively still being held by the government in the form of its military. The Tuareg, meanwhile, claimed a separate state in the north. Although secular, their primary complaint had to do with exclusion and ethnic issues. But the Ansar Dine and the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which affectionately is called AQUIM, as a kind of junior partner, took over and essentially displaced the Tuareg. The result was a more Islamic, more theocratic, more fundamentalist quote, government, quote, in the north, which began some unfortunate stoning, amputations, terrorism, destroying tombs of saints that were beloved much by the Tuareg as well as the other part of Mali, and rampaging through Timbuktu and other towns in the north. The military government was powerless to stop the Islamists. Of course, that was their complaint, even against the Tuareg. And in December, UN Security Council passed a resolution that, or devised a plan rather, to retake the north. It authorized but did not fund 3,000 plus member multinational, multilateral African force and a complementary mission of Malian soldiers to try to retake the north. Simultaneously, there were unsuccessful efforts to negotiate with the Islamists and to avoid a military confrontation. But shortly thereafter, January 10th, the French, the Islamists stormed the town of Kona and began to threaten Bamako. The next day, on the 11th, France began to intervene at the request of what was left of the central government in Mali, and responded with airstrikes and 4,000 ground troops, primarily airborne troops, to attack, flush out, destroy, defeat the Islamists in the north. The Islamists retreated, melted away, again, shades of Taliban, but only to regroup in the mountains and potentially to fight again. Meanwhile, France announced that it was not going to stay, had no interest in a long-term presence, and that it would be withdrawing within several weeks, an announcement that was reached quite a bit of skepticism on the part of observers who thought that the French were not likely to withdraw in several weeks, and as it turned out, they haven't. So the question is what happens in Mali and what happens in all of North Africa, especially since a lot of these weapons came from Libya, a now sort of chaotic environment, but a chaotic environment with large stocks of weapons that have gotten into the hands of AQIM, and it's a particularly worrisome concern that they have managed to get these weapons and to retain their retreated areas in the mountains. So the entire area is becoming increasingly dangerous. The potential for spillover from Libya into Mali, from Mali into next door neighbors, and the whole of the Sahel. So that's sort of the background against which the question is what, again, to repeat, how do we understand what's been happening in Mali other than these sheer facts, and what can we learn from the Malian experience, and so on, the three questions I put. So the person who knows all of this is Vicki Huddleston, as Stephanie mentioned, who was ambassador to Mali, but in a happier time.
In a happier time.
Just one personal matter, if I can. I don't know if you know this, but I was part of the Malian delegation to the Community of Democracies, and you can tell that because I'm indistinguishable from the rest of the Malian delegation.
How did that happen?
Yeah.
Anyway, Jerry, thank you. I'm so glad you could be here and give us that breakdown. And it's great to be with Tim as well, because Tim and I have both done Africa and Haiti. I guess there are quite a few of us around. You know, this evening it was like I would have liked to have been in the Malian desert rather than out there trying to get here with President Obama arriving at someplace very, very nearby. But it's good to be with you, and thank you very much. And I would say that Somalia, Mali, there's more than just a name that's sort of familiar, and I hope that we can draw some lessons from Somalia. And I also think that both countries face many of the same challenges. Let me just start by saying that the West has played a role for war and peace in sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps more than any other place in the world. Whether you think about colonial borders and the conflicts that they have led to, Nigeria, Sudan, Mali, indeed Mali, or colonial practices, genocide in Rwanda, or climate change, genocide in Darfur, and then intervention of the West, the United States and the United Nations in Somalia. And then we walked away and forgot about Somalia, but Tim's going to tell us more about that, for at least a decade. And that ignoring of Somalia, in my opinion, led to many of the problems today. And now we have a French intervention in Mali against radical Islam. This is a conflict, the first conflict in Africa between the West and radical Islam. And if we are lucky and if we do the right thing, maybe this will be the last conflict between the West and radical Islam on the African continent. So you look at me and you say, well, how did it happen, and is that really right? Well, I know you're thinking about the Tuareg insurgency. Jerry mentioned it, and the Malian state itself. Let me just say that when we think about Mali, we usually think about Mali along the Niger and to the south of the Niger. And we think about people who get along, have a wonderful, diverse culture, and have had democracy almost for 2 decades. But if you go up to the north of Mali, we're talking about a different people, a different language, a different culture, a different ethnicity. From the very beginning, the Tuaregs petitioned the French to be independent. And the French said, no, you're part of Mali, Senegal, which was the first state. And so there have been successive rebellions in the north because the northern people do not want to be part of Mali, which is governed by the 90% of the population, which is sub-Saharan African. But my focus is not on the Tuareg insurgency. That's been dealt with before, mainly by Mali's neighbors, Libya and Algeria, because we're talking about North African people. But what happened in Mali is something a bit different. The first Al-Qaeda came in to Mali in 2003. I was there. It was the Group for Salafist Prayer and Combat, led by El Para, nom de guerre of the Fox. He brought with him 15 mainly German tourists as hostages. The Germans paid the hostage money, between $5 and $7 million. They were released, and then the European command helped Algeria, Mali, Niger, and Chad, empowered them with intelligence to go after this first Al-Qaeda group that came in that was part of the Islamic Salvation Army, a remnant of the Algerian Civil War. And they were successful. He was defeated in Chad, and El Para's in jail. Then came the successor organization. But by that time, by the time they began to get strong on what? Smuggling. They involved themselves in the local culture, which is smuggling, cocaine in particular, and then ransom. By 2009, ransom was being paid for tourists taken, and by not just tourists, but business people taken hostage from Germany, from France, from Switzerland, from Spain, and from Canada. David Cohen, Undersecretary of the Treasury, said about $120 million to North Africa, Mali, and Yemen. The bulk of that went to Mali. So you have this group of Al-Qaeda getting stronger, recruiting, getting arms, and getting so strong that the Africans in the group say, we don't have the objective of overtaking the Algerian government anymore. We would like to overtake West Africa as well. And we also have payments of ransom going through the Malian government to Iyad al-Ghali. Does that name ring a bell? Who's the head of Ansar Din, which is the religious extremist group of the Tuareg nationalists. So those are the three protagonists who are the protagonists against France and the West. The lack of a good military strategy to defeat the Al-Qaeda terrorists allowed them to grow and to use those payments of ransom. And they expanded throughout the Sahara. They operated with impunity from the Atlantic Ocean into Chad, from southern Algeria, and formed links with Boko Haram down in northern Nigeria. And links, as the Libyan war went on, with Ansar al-Sharia in Benghazi, the group that probably killed our ambassador and his colleagues. When Gaddafi fell, the Tuareg troops he had integrated into his army came back to Mali and joined both the religious and secular insurgents. But the weapons all came into the rich Al-Qaeda franchises of AQIM and Mujahideen. They quickly pushed aside the secular local insurgents, and with the three Al-Qaeda or extremist insurgents, then took the north. And for 10 months, nobody did anything. And that meant Al-Qaeda sympathizers came from around the world. And a group that was 50 in 2002 is now 5,000. Iyad al-Ghali, who had insurgents of 20 when I was there, is now supposed to have like perhaps 1,000. But they did one thing wrong. They didn't follow the instructions of Drukal, who's the emir in Algeria, who told them, go easy, no harsh punishments, don't impose harsh Sharia. They did, then they moved south and the French intervened. Had the French intervened, I think Mali would have fallen, a country of 12 million people with a foreign ideology imposed on them. So there was little choice. But now the next choice is, what do we learn from Somalia that we can now apply to Mali? And one of the first things I would say is don't ignore the problem. Don't try to contain it. You must defeat it if it's Al-Qaeda. Thank you.
Wonderful. It's good to be with you all. I'm going to be a lot more definite here than I have any intellectual right to be, given my background, but that's so I can provoke questions from you all, and I much look forward to that, as I know Vicki and Jerry do too. Yes, it's a fair question to ask whether Somalia is relevant to Mali. And it is indeed happily getting better, as Jerry said. It is, as a matter of fact, emerging from being a failed state. At least it's been doing so in about the last year and a half or two. But for a country like Somalia, there's a problem with that metaphor, in that, yes, there are about 10 million people in Somalia. Most of them are the same ethnic group, language, religion, Identity is by clan, though, rather than by seeing themselves part of a nation. In fact, clan identity has been demonstrated to be every bit as dangerous as tribalism can be. The problem you have in Somalia is that it is a nation, but it is not, in fact, a state. Everybody, as I said, is Somali. They're all part of what it is to be Somali, but there's no country there. And what we have seen for about the last 22 years is an effort to restructure, to create governance in a space that fell completely apart once the dictator Siad Barre fell into civil war in 1991. As Jerry indicated, it was that period, 1991 on, that caused a huge humanitarian emergency. Some of you are too young to know what the CNN effect is. Well, it was that. It was all the images on our television screens of starving Somalis that got the international community engaged in an effort to try to resolve the situation, which we thought, or at least pretended to think, was humanitarian in Somalia. And that cascaded from an ineffectual initial United Nations effort to an ineffectual secondary US effort to an ineffectual third UN effort that by March of 1995 had so completely, remember the movie Black Hawk Down? Had so completely demonstrated its incompetence and inability to be of any real value that it ended. Thus, there was Somalia on its own, being more or less ignored, certainly by the West, from 1995 on. Well, plenty was happening there. One of the interesting things that I would get from the odd friend who would occasionally dip into the matter of Somali was a huge, active, dynamic retail economy. And telecommunications, there was, of course, always a market for an interesting substance called khat, which is chewed and renders pretty much anybody incapable of doing anything after midday. So I understand from people where it is mostly consumed, which is Yemen. But essentially, you only began to get serious governance outside or larger than the clan or sub-clan even in about 2000 with the formation of a transitional national government. Now that morphed into a transitional federal government 4 years later. And it is that federal government, as I understand it, that actually created or recreated the military of Somalia, moving away, and here's a vital aspect as you look at Mali and Somalia, and a difference, is they moved away by creating a national military from the reliance on the clan militias that had been the important and indeed almost only players from the 90s until the mid part of this millennium, this decade of the millennium. This transitional federal government wound up in deep trouble. There was an Islamist movement, known as the Islamic Courts Union, that held sway in the south of Somalia. It showed itself sufficiently powerful that the Ethiopians got seriously concerned. There is an Islamist movement in Ethiopia itself as well, in the part of Ethiopia that used to be Somalia that the British, never mind, we don't need to go there. It gets more complicated than ever we need to talk about at this event. But the Ethiopians came in support of the transitional federal government and the regional authorities that had established themselves in the center and the north of of Somalia, and they all went at it, hammer and tongs, ferociously, until basically the Islamic Courts Union was defeated in, if I'm not mistaken, December of 2006, and we got an African mission, African Union mission in Somalia created in January of 2007, and that mission has been there ever since, and it was just renewed in January of this year for 6 months. We've got that mission renewed. Now, rather than go into the history of that, which is basically derived from efforts by the regional, and here's an important component of any solution, by the Regional Intergovernmental Authority on Development that created a body that basically did not adequately work. And there's been an argument in AMISOM, as it's affectionately called, on whether it should be peacekeeping or peace enforcement. And that argument continues in the report with which the AU Strategic Review Commission released in January, as it looked at the future of what the region might do in Somalia. So what we wound up with was an regional effort, much broader actually than the regional. We've got troops from, of course, Ethiopia, Kenya, Burundi in there, but we've also got troops from Sierra Leone, of all places, involved in Somalia now. In fact, if I look at my short list of troops, we've had pledges from Nigeria, Malawi, Burundi, Djibouti, and Guinea to be part of this Africa Union effort, broad Africa Union effort, no longer just regional Africa Union effort in Somalia. The fighting continues. The Islamic Courts Union splintered. A number of the Islamist elements of the Courts Union joined the transitional federal government. But the really bad guys, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, Al-Shabaab, or Al-Shabaab, if you want a better Arabic pronunciation, continues to this day to hold significant portions of Somali territory and to be the main enemy of peace and stability and a growing effort at governance in Somalia. The last element of that effort was the formation in August, September of last year of a Somali federal government, acceptance of a provisional federal constitution, nomination of a president in September of last year, and the beginning of permanent, and I'm not going to use the word democratic, which you will find in Wikipedia's exposition on all this, but let's say a permanent political set of institutions in Somalia. What's going to happen next? Well, we've got the report of the Africa Union Commission on the Strategic Review of et cetera, that came out in mid-January, that notes Al-Shabaab control, that insists on the need for AMISOM having a, quote, robust peace enforcement. That's Chapter 7 for those who are into the UN vocabulary, peace enforcement capacity. And the strategic review argues for 3 possible scenarios for the future, settling on the third, and the third is a new joint Africa Union, United Nations mission should be established, and one that has that robust peace enforcement capability. Also at issue, and here's another lesson for Mali, lots of complaint from the AU Strategic Review Commission about the unpredictability of international funding for their effort. and insistence that that needs to be resolved if there is going to be a future mission. The AU only extended the mission for 6 months. It had the authority to do so for 1 year. There was some argument for 9 months. They settled on 6, where there's much more to be done in Somalia.
Great. So let me see if I can try to put a couple of these pieces together and see what you think about that, especially what have we learned and what should U.S. policy be. So there are some similarities here. Vicki, you're arguing that ignoring Somalia led to Mali. Tim, you're arguing that ignoring Somalia led to Somalia. That we have UN authorized interventions, but no funding for them in both cases. That I take it.
There is in Somalia. There's funding in Somalia.
Yeah, now in Somalia. But, so I take it and we have AQIM and Al-Shabaab, so similar kinds of unfortunate actors. So if, please add if you want some similarities and dissimilarities if you like, but what are we to take away from that for U.S. policy, but also international policy?
Well, the first thing that I really want to make very strongly, and I was trying to make earlier, is that you have a foreign al-Qaeda from Algeria, Algerian-led, AQIM. Algerian are the principal troops. They have a breakaway, which is Mujao, which has other African troops that imposed a foreign religion, a foreign ideology on the people of northern Mali. We don't have that in Somalia. You have in Somalia homegrown insurgency that with links to al-Qaeda, where Somalia al-Shabaab is similar to Ansar Din, the Iyad Aga Ghali local insurgency in the north of Mali. But the major players in Mali are foreign, Algerian, AQIM, Mauritanian-led Mujao. So to me, that's really important. The second thing that's really important is the United States backed the African Union, the Ugandans and the Burundians, to give them the capacity to fight al-Shabaab in Somalia. And that, when we began to do that, they really began to be successful. With the with the intelligence, with the equipment, by giving the Africans the capacity to face their own and fight and defeat their own problem. We failed to do that in Mali. In Mali, we trained the Malian troops, but we didn't give them the intelligence, we didn't give them the coordination, we didn't give them the mentoring because we were worried about the problem of the insurgency in the north, and we also were increasingly worried about militarization of the continent by that bad AFRICOM that had been created. And anyway, all the focus was on Somalia. But I think the lesson I take away is that once the AU was there, with the approval of the UN, there was a real willingness to back. But in Mali, there was never an AU, there was never a UN. And so that real willingness to back the region to defeat the al-Qaeda was never there.
But it's been early days compared to Somalia. After all, Somalia starts in 10 years ago.
Mali started in 2002. The Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Initiative was designed for Mali. Our first counterterrorism initiative in Africa was for Mali. And that's when we helped the region defeat the first al-Qaeda franchise that came over. It was because we subsequently changed our policy to not empowering the region. Mauritania wasn't democratic, Niger wasn't democratic, and Chad wasn't democratic, so we only had Mali to work with.
So the mistake was in not supporting, funding, equipping the AU in Mali.
Well, there was no AU. First mistake, no AU. Okay. The second mistake, we changed our policy from helping the region defeat the Al-Qaeda franchise that was in the north, that we knew was in the north, that we were concerned about, and saying, no, we'll just help the region contain it. And how you can't contain it when you're getting $90 million worth of ransom, and you're buying weapons, and you're getting recruits, and then you have the black swan that no one expected of Libya. I mean, it could have stayed up there for quite a while, but Libya really blew everything up. And I have no complaints with the conflict in Libya. I think it was well done, and it was done for humanitarian purposes, but the consequences were substantial.
So again, the lesson you would draw is it should have been a defeat strategy rather than a containment strategy,
Exactly.
and it should have been
And it was initially.
an African, multilateral African force equipped and supplied. That's the lesson that you
Yes.
would.
Yes,
And
and
that's not
Algeria,
happened.
in fact, tried to do it, but never had the force to quite make it work.
Want to jump in here or not?
That sounds fairly sage. It took a long time and an enormous amount of blood and treasure in Somalia to begin to get it right.
Exactly.
And I'm not going to sit here in front of you this evening and say they've gotten it right, because it's still very fragile in Somalia. Let's be sure of that. But it seems to me that with the combination of U.S. money, regional and broad African boots on the ground, Somali, and here may be something that might be relevant in Mali too, Somali, including diaspora, engagement in and beginning to build the structures of governance, that seems to be a more sensible way forward. Let me go back, circle around back, and note one point. The current federal government of Somalia has a couple of Islamist, and by that I mean stout supporters of Islam as ruling everyday life, elements in it. 2 days ago, I believe it was, a new commander-in-chief was just appointed who is said to be from one of the Islamist elements that are part of the federal government. So if these Islamist elements are willing to play politically with everyone else, which al-Shabaab is not, is avowedly not, then it strikes me that given the realities of the situation, certainly in Somalia, there needs to be space for them to the extent they can prove that they have peaceful support.
I couldn't agree more, but you know, I want to make sure we hit on it, because there's one really big similarity, and in it is a difference too. Mm-hmm. Both countries have major separatist movements. In Somalia, the separatists aren't in the fight. That's Somaliland. Mm-hmm. In Mali, they're in the fight. But I think both countries have to look at how do you deal with your separatist movement, because I don't think the military of the transitional federal government is going to be going up to Somaliland anytime soon, right? They wouldn't be too welcome up there.
No, they're not. And in fact, 2 days ago, the Prime Minister of Somaliland was in Turkey, even though, as I understand it, no country has actually recognized them. They are nevertheless dealing, because they're essentially a rational bunch of players who are serving the people, dealing with them pragmatically.
And so there has to be an answer from the AU and from the United Nations and Somalia on Somaliland. Actually, the AU needs to begin to think about what do you do with states that want to be autonomous or want to be independent. Now, northern Mali is not going to be independent because it has no economic viability other than smuggling routes and ransom. But it does want to be autonomous, and I think the AU has to come up with some processes.
Well, there is a way forward if you look at Somalia, in that there are two regions there. The one I know best, because I've been to Bosaso, is Punt Land, named after Ramses II's inscription, in which he notes that his gold washers have gone to the land of Punt. Gold washers, instant, you know it's quartz, they're crushing it. Same California process we all know and love, made us great. Probably isn't. In fact, there's another argument that northern Sudan is what was in fact the land of Punt with its lack of water. Pity the gold washers. In any case, that is a regional, semi-autonomous entity that does not seek independence, but Somaliland, there would have to be some serious progress, I would guess, in Mogadishu and in the relationship between Mogadishu and the two semi-autonomous regions in order for Somaliland to be attracted by that to return to a greater Somalia.
And that's what worries me right now in Mali, because the Europeans and maybe even ourselves are talking about training the Malian army. There are two reasons not to train the Malian army. The first is the coup plotters are still running the government. And so why would we train the Malian army so that the coup plotters can, overthrow the next democratically elected government in Mali? But more importantly, you cannot send Malian troops who are 90% from south of the Niger River up into the north. You notice who's fighting in the north. It's the secular Malians who were pushed out by the Al-Qaeda franchises, the National Movement for the Liberation of Assawad, the Chadians, and the French, because they can fight in the desert and they're willing to fight for their land. An old chief told me when I was up in the desert, it was during the time of the first Islamic army that came over, and he said, "You will never control the desert unless you work with us. We have been masters of the desert for thousands of years. The desert in the north of Mali will never be safe from Al-Qaeda, smugglers, separatists, whoever you want, until the people in the area, the North Africans, are in control of that area and providing the security in that area, because the Malian troops don't know the language, they don't know the desert, and they're generally afraid to go up there unless they go up with integrated troops who do know the area."
Why don't we open this up, just in case people didn't follow the Somalia business. There were two parts of Somalia that remained unaffected, more or less, by this complete chaos. One was Puntland, one was Somaliland. And Somaliland at least wants its independence, so just in case people don't follow Somalia like Tim does. Okay, may we open the floor? Questions, please?
My question is, if you see a future for the counterterrorism partnership that you discussed, or in the region, the Saharan counterterrorism partnership, or if you think that due to the number of nations that have undergone coups in the past few years as part of this partnership, has made it somewhat ineffective.
I'm sorry, I looked at it. Can you just say the last part of your?
If you think that the counterterrorism partnership is somewhat ineffective due to the number of nations that have undergone coups in that region.
Well, actually, this is an issue that I think at some point would be very interesting to look at. How do you deal with counterterrorism, countering terrorism, when you have a bunch of undemocratic states? Now, Jerry's going to answer me and say you don't deal with the undemocratic states. But that's what we did in the case of West Africa. Those states were undemocratic. It was Chad, it was Niger, and it was Mauritania, and we pulled out, in fact, our military assistance. But those states, there's no counterterrorism strategy in the region if, 4 of the 5 states involved, we can't give assistance to, Algeria and the other 3. So we were left with Mali. So I think that's another reason we should have had a long time ago an African Union presence. Then you wouldn't have the problem of dealing with those undemocratic states.
It would be an African Union presence that was composed mostly of North African, of Sahelian troops. An African Union, but not with Nigerians, not with Ugandans, not with...
Well, for northern Mali,
Yeah.
definitely, yeah, definitely.
I think if I might add to that, this is less about what the U.S. should be doing than about what those states whose interests are most directly engaged, the regional states, as Vicki Huddleston has already named, as well as the Africa Union. Now, in Somalia, as I understand it, some U.S. money goes not to the entities that are actually doing the training there, but rather to the Africa Union mission, which then pays the bills for the training. Some sort of creative financing like that might be a way to do it.
Stanley Kober. Sun Tzu in The Art of War said you should know your enemy, but you should also know yourself. We can talk about interests, but quite frankly, as I look at the United States, the American people are simply not interested in intervention, and especially in putting boots on the ground. Not anymore. We're getting out of Iraq. We're out of Iraq. We're getting out of Afghanistan. We're not going to put boots on the ground in Libya. Just not going to happen. So we try to find other people to do in the region to do it for us. But this, to my mind, raises the specter of Afghanistan. That's what we did in Afghanistan. We armed and encouraged and trained the Mujahideen, right? And then what happened? I was lecturing in India in 1990, and I was told they're now coming over the border, having defeated the Soviets. They're coming against us in India. Turned out they were right. How do you know, if you train these people, that they will not, once victorious, turn against you?
I want to say one thing about the boots on the ground. I don't disagree with you, but where the American people are coming from, I hope the American people begin to change on that, because in essence, what we're looking at is more like a police action. I mean, the French had to use air power, they had to use land mobility, they had to use good command and control, but it essentially was providing that extra command and control leadership and what the Africans didn't have, which was the air power. And they've lost about 4 troops, I think. So it's not like, okay, American boots on the ground, we're gonna go get bogged down in Mali or wherever it is. I mean, we're still thinking about Somalia when we think about combat boots on the ground. I hope that we begin to think about being more robust when you have true challenges. For example, Lord's Resistance Army. We have special forces mentoring them, on the ground with them, helping them plan and look for Joseph Kony. I mean, that kind of hands-on really makes a difference. And if Africa is going to be the new area for Al-Qaeda, then I think that might be what has to be done.
But just to distill that for a second, are you suggesting that there should be sort of two forces international? One in the south to deal with the military coup and restore the government in the south. The other, a separate one, composed primarily of Chadians, Nigerians, and so on, in the north to deal with the...
That's
isn't
actually the case right now.
That's your argument, isn't it?
That's exactly what you
Okay,
have to do.
so the question is, how are you going to make sure that either one of those two African Union forces stays loyal to the ultimate outcome that you want? Isn't that your question?
Well, I think if they're all under the AU and the United Nations. As long in the south, you're going to have West African troops under the AU, led by the Nigerians. They will stay, loyal to the Malian government and to the goals of the African Union and the United Nations. In the north, it'll either be the French or the Algerians, and theirs will be to provide stability within the region in the north. So I don't see a conflict there between those two. Where I see the future conflict, and we need to begin now to avoid it, is what happens in the north for stability. Because in the end, the only stability, once the international troops leave, is if you leave a well-trained force of the northern nomads. And so you need an understanding with the Malian government of the status of the north.
Plus at least autonomy.
I think it has to be autonomy.
I was lecturing at Commander General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth and had lunch with the commandant at the time, whom I had known from my days in Baghdad in 2003. And we were discussing this very same question, and he said, I see. What you're asking is, how do we know we're not training a coup force? And the answer is, we don't. Basically, all of those people who've gone through Command and General Staff, all of those people who've been international visitors in the United States through one U.S. government program or another, we don't know what they are going to turn into. One of them turned out to be F.W. de Klerk. I submit that was a winner to bring him to the United States in 1976. Others have become coup leaders in their countries. You just give it your best shot.
But Tim, isn't the second part of that you're not training only Malians, you're putting this under an AU command? Isn't that your argument?
Yeah, if it's under an AU command, I don't think you have to worry about,
An AU command of Nigerians in the south.
Nigerians in the south, an AU command of Algeria.
Yes.
France
Essentially,
in the north.
you do what you can to broaden the understanding of the people who you're mentoring, and you do it by having a broad international coalition, hoping that that understanding will be conveyed and internalized. It's not in any way guaranteed, though.
Ambassador Huddleston, you touched on this a little bit, but it's still not clear to me, if you're the French or possibly other international actors getting involved, what exactly is the end state you hope for? And what are the chances, the likelihood that the security situation, when it becomes more secure, is likely to be durable for the long term?
Well, thank you. My favorite question. Well, first of all, defeat Al-Qaeda franchise, secure the North with the international under AU, UN, train a local force that can take over in due course, autonomy for the North so that they can be responsible for their own defense, but there's an agreement with the Malian government, and then repair the broken Malian state. Because I think right now, that's a huge problem. Elections in July, that's the rainy season, not a great idea. Turnout for elections in Mali has been notoriously low for the last 10 years, some of the lowest in the world. So we're going to end up with a government that has little legitimacy and coup plotters behind the scenes still pulling the strings. And how are they going to be able to deal with this enormous problem in the north, plus the new divisions, religious, that have appeared throughout now the Malian state. So we, the United States, France, the African Union, and the United Nations need to be very, very careful about how we help Mali put the state back together, that we don't rush them into anything that in fact is going to discredit them, because you said, is it Somalia? I think that was our first question, and it could be a Somalia if the Malian state begins to fail, because they are not seen as legitimate.
First of all, there is one more similarity between Somalia and Mali, which is the Shabab, as well as the AQIM, both got their funding and start from the Salafist Wahhabite networks of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And we have not broken our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which we should have a while back on this question. The other point I would make is I think the overthrow of Gaddafi, the regime change policy, which first came from Tony Blair, was a big mistake, and I anticipated this would happen. I think other people could have as well. I don't think it was totally serendipitous that all of a sudden the Tuaregs started moving south and all this cache of arms was available. I have two questions for Ambassador Huddleston. One is the role of Algeria. Seems to me they're the most stable fortified element in that region as a state, but it seemed to me you implied when you said the emir in Algeria is somehow giving orders. Is Algeria playing a double role in the way that came across? Are they, and other people have accused them of playing a double role, though I think they still would be the country to work with, although there's a lot of historical problems with the French there. The other thing you left out of your solution was economic development. Unless there's massive economic development for this region, water, food, energy, you're never going to solve the counterterrorism problem, ever, because there's no military solution, and I would like you to address both of those.
Well, I don't have to say too much about the second part because you're absolutely right. And when we had the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Initiative, development was a very big part of it. So yes, you obviously really have to have development because you have to have jobs other than smuggling for the young men in the area. Algeria, a lot of people say they do play a double role, but I think Algeria is more concerned about terrorism than almost any other state in the world because of the 10-year war that ended in 2002 with the Islamic Army. And what they did is they formed a unit of the countries we've mentioned, Mali and its neighbors, at Tamarasset. And that unit was supposed to counter al-Qaeda. And it was never really successful. And some people said, oh, well, that's because Algeria never wants it to be successful because they want to keep these bad guys in Mali. They don't want them back in Algeria. One of the problems is Algeria has a really strong feeling that it shouldn't intervene in other countries. Although Mali said it could intervene, it didn't intervene. Another problem there also was Algeria and the region more than Algeria, I think, saw it as a Western problem. It's al-Qaeda, that's a Western problem, that's not our problem. They're stronger than we are. It's your enemy, it's not our enemy. We don't like them, but we can make money with them on ransoms, on smuggling and things like that. So Algeria is key to solution because the Tuaregs are in Algeria, Chad, Libya, Mali, and the Barabish in Mauritania and Mali, and all that area that goes up into Libya has to be secured. And so Algeria has to be part of that because it, as you say, has the military that can provide that capacity.
Well, thank you very much. I think we should come back next month and start where we just ended. And then we have some really torturous problems to deal with, not just Mali and Somalia, which are, you know, piece of cake. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for joining us in this discussion. Thanks, Vicki. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.